the eyes of many, pony cars are a subclass of muscle cars. But unlike the so-called true muscle cars that were based on mid-size sedans, pony cars were based on compact cars with distinct styling of their own, getting their name from the Ford Mustang. Hardly the first compact-based performance car, but it was the one that caused the segment to explode. The Mustang was introduced in 1964 as a 65 model, as a notchback coupe based on the Ford Falcon. It was a similar 182 inches long, but on a shorter 108-inch wheelbase, and weighed 2,600 to 2,900 pounds. Within a few months, a convertible and fastback were added to the line. Initially, the base engine was a 2.8-liter, 170 cubic inch straight six with 101 horsepower, soon upgraded to a 3.3-liter 200 with 120 horsepower, earning the car the nickname the Secretary's car, as they were more fashionable than sporty. For those that wanted performance, though, there were optional V8s, starting with a 4.3-liter 260 with 164 horsepower, but that would be dropped mid-year, in favor of the bigger 4.7-liter 289 with 200 to 271 horsepower, for a quarter mile in under 15 seconds and a top speed over 120. But if that wasn't enough, Shelby America would modify one for improved performance as the GT350, lighter weight but with no back seat, and upgraded with better brakes, and to produce 306 horsepower, shaving another second off the quarter mile. And of course, there was an even more powerful race-ready GT350R. With Mustang prices starting between $2,300 and $2,600, it is perhaps no surprise that it was the most successful introductory model of all time, selling a total of 680,000 for the 1965 model year, so changes for 1966 would be minimal. But there would be a special edition Shelby GT350H, created specifically for the Hertz rental car agency. The car would get bigger for 1967, 2 inches longer and nearly 3 inches wider, and more than 300 pounds heavier, all in order to make room for bigger engines, such as the 320 horsepower 6.4-liter 390, a 14-second car capable of more than 130 miles an hour. Shelby went even bigger, adding a GT500, powered by a 7-liter 428, rated at 335 horsepower, although estimated to be actually closer to 400, while getting more distinct styling that included taillights from the new Mercury Cougar. In addition to cosmetic changes, 1968 saw the 289 replaced by a 4.9-liter 302 with 210 to 230 horsepower, or 250 in the Shelby GT350. And Shelby added the GT500 King of the Road, which bumped torque of the 428 up by 20, making it a sub-14-second car. Or you could get a California Special, providing the look of the Shelby, sort of, without the added performance. The cars would be restyled again for 1969, getting another 4 inches longer and an inch wider, and gaining more than 300 pounds. A bigger 6 became available, a 4.1-liter 250 with 155 horsepower, and a 5.8-liter 351 was added to the options list for 250 to 290 horsepower. Also new were the 290 horsepower Boss 302 for Trans Am racing, and the NASCAR-inspired 375 horsepower Boss 429, the later being a high 13-second car, and the earlier a low 15-second car, capable of more than 130 miles an hour. The Mustang also gained a Mach 1 appearance and features package, and a Grande luxury package, while the new Shelby was barely even recognizable as a Mustang, and the GT350 now used the 290 horsepower 351. Styling was subdued for 1970, and the Shelbys would go away, but the 351 Windsor was replaced by a 351 Cleveland with 300 horsepower. There was another restyle for 1971, getting 2 inches longer and 2 inches wider on an inch longer wheelbase, gaining enough weight to be 1,200 pounds more than the original, earning it the nickname the Fat Mustang. The smaller 6 was dropped, and the big 6 was down 5 horsepower. The 302 was only offered as the 210 horsepower two-barrel version, but the 351 Cleveland was offered in 240 to 285 horsepower tunes, or 330 horsepower as the Boss 351. And the big engine was a 429 Cobra Jet with 370 to 375 horsepower, with the Boss 351 being a low 14-second car and the 429 Cobra Jet a high 13-second car, although that would be dropped the following year, and the move to net ratings made things seem worse than they were, with the 250 straight 6 being re-rated at 95 horsepower and the 302 140 horsepower, making the performance options the 266 horsepower 351 Cobra Jet and the 275 horsepower 351 high output, still a mid-14-second car, with the 351 Cobra Jet being the top version for 1973, when sales were down to under 135,000. So it was decided the Mustang needed to return to its origin as a smaller, lighter car, and the new Mustang II of 1974 was based on the subcompact Pinto, and didn't even offer a V8 its first year, the top engine being a 2.8-liter V6 with 105 horsepower. But sales still leapt to nearly 420,000 for the year. Originally, the Mustang's only real competitor was the Plymouth Barracuda, introduced a few months earlier as a '64 model. It was little more than a fastback version of the Valiant, with a minor facelift, and initially badged as the Valiant Barracuda. As such, it was 188 inches long on a 106-inch wheelbase, and weighed 2,700 to 2,900 pounds. It came with a standard 2.8-liter 170 cubic inch slant 6 with 101 horsepower, and an optional 3.7-liter 225 slant 6 with 145 horsepower. The only V8 was the new 4.5-liter 273 with 180 horsepower for a sub-17-second quarter mile and a top speed near 115, with prices starting just under $2,400, roughly $25,000 sold the first year. But it would become its own model for 1965, drop the smaller 6, and gain a 235 horsepower Commando version of the V8, and gained a Performance S package that added improved suspension and brakes, putting it in the mid-15-second range and raising top speed to over 125. It would be the Barracuda's best year at 65,000 sold. But the facelift of 1966 actually had them looking more like the Valiant, although that would change for 1967, with all new distinct styling as a coupe, convertible, and fastback, and a 6.3-liter 383 with 280 horsepower becoming an option. A car capable of 120 miles an hour and a quarter mile in under 15 seconds, and gaining another 20 horsepower the following year, although it was up to 193 inches long on a 108-inch wheelbase, and weight was up more than 200 pounds. For 1968, the 273 would be replaced by a 5.2-liter 318 with 230 horsepower, and a 275 horsepower 5.6-liter 340 was added, and 50 race-ready versions with a fiberglass front end and a 7-liter 426 Hemi were sold, referred to as the A-Bomb. The 383 gained another 30 horsepower for 1969, but the top engine became a 375 horsepower 7.2-liter 440, making it a 14-second car. But there would be an all-new bigger Barracuda for 1970. Although it was 5 inches shorter on a similar 108-inch wheelbase, it was more than 3 inches wider and more than 200 pounds heavier. For those that preferred the older version, the new Valiant Duster was essentially that car with updated styling, with the 340 being the biggest engine. The new car had the same standard 225 slant 6, and the 318, 340, 383, and 440 V8s carried over, although the 340 could now be had with a 6-pack with 3 two-barrels for 290 horsepower, offered in the All-American Racer, or AAR CUDA. A setup also offered on the bigger 440 for 390 horsepower, giving it a mid-13-second quarter mile. But if that wasn't enough, the Hemi CUDA's 7-liter 426 pumped out 425 horsepower for a quarter mile around 13 seconds. The AAR and the 346 pack would be gone for 1971, and the 383, 426, and 440 would be dropped the following year, with the move to net ratings making the 340 with 240 horsepower the top engine, over the 150 horsepower 318 and 110 horsepower slant 6. The 340 CUDA was still a mid-15-second car, making it slower than the cheaper 340 Duster by nearly half a second, with both cars moving to a slightly more powerful 5.9-liter 360 for 1974, the final year of the Barracuda, with just over 10,000 made, while the better-selling Duster would carry on through 1976, and beyond as the Volare Duster. GM entered the segment in 1967, starting with the Chevrolet Camaro, 185 inches long on a 108-inch wheelbase, and 2,900 to 3,600 pounds. Engines ranged from straight sixes of 3.8 liters and 230 cubic inches, or 4.1 liters and 250 cubic inches, with 140 or 155 horsepower. Most export models used a 4.6-liter 283 with 195 horsepower, but in the U.S., the base V8 was a 5.4-liter 327 with 210 to 295 horsepower, and only in the Super Sport was the 295 horsepower 5.7-liter 350, with the top engine being a 6.5-liter 396 with 325 to 375 horsepower. A low 14-second car capable of 135 miles an hour, with the 290 horsepower 4.9-liter 302 only being offered in the Z28 as a Trans Am package. First-year sales were over 220,000. Styling would be refreshed by 1969, and sales would continue to creep up, now over 240,000. About an inch longer and a couple of 100 pounds heavier, with the base V8 becoming a 5-liter 307 with 200 horsepower. The 350 became available in non-Super Sport models with 250 to 255 horsepower, while the Super Sports had 300 horsepower. And the big 7-liter 427 began to be offered through GM's Special Order COPO program, providing 425 to 430 horsepower. The 1969 styling would carry over to 1970 as the restyled 70 models were delayed. But when they arrived, the new cars were 2 inches longer and nearly 100 pounds heavier, and a fastback for the first time, with improved suspension, making it one of the best handling cars of the period, particularly the Z28 package. The smaller 6 was dropped, a 360 horsepower LT1 350 became the Z28 engine, and the 396 was replaced by a 6.6-liter 402 with 350 to 375 horsepower. Power would be down for 1971 performance engines, with the 402 dropping from 350 to 300 gross, or 260 net, and the LT1 was down from 360 to 330 gross, or to 275 net, a mid-14-second car capable of 125 miles an hour, while the others remained relatively unchanged, with the 6 at 110, the 307 at 139, and the other 350s 165 to 210 net. There would be less power for 1972, with the 307 down to 130 horsepower, and the Super Sport 350 down to 200 horsepower, the LT1 Z28 250 horsepower, and the Super Sport 396, or 402, to 240 horsepower, and both the Super Sport and the 402 would be dropped by the end of the year. Power would continue to decline, with the 6 dropping to 100 horsepower, the 307 to 115, and the 350 to 145 to 175, or 240 for the LT1, and the 396 would be dropped by the end of the year. Styling was updated for 1974 to accommodate the new bigger 5-mile-an-hour bumpers, gaining 7 inches and 200 pounds. The 307 was discontinued, but sales had recovered from the strikes and other production issues, climbing back up to 150,000. The Z28 and LT1 were discontinued for 1975, leaving the 350 with 145 to 155 horsepower, partially to appease insurance companies. But the 6-cylinder was back up to 105 horsepower, and visibility was improved with a wraparound rear window. For 1976, a 5-liter 305 with 140 horsepower became available, and the top 350 was back up to 165 horsepower, although some suggest it never actually dropped. And both V8s would get a 5-horsepower bump for 1977, and the Z28 package returned, primarily as an appearance package. But for 1978, it would get an additional 15 horsepower, and 1979 would be the Camaro's best-selling year at over 280,000. For 1980, the base engine became a 3.8-liter Buick V6 with 115 horsepower, and a 4.4-liter 267 V8 was added for 120 horsepower. The 305 was up to 155 horsepower, and the Z28 190, if you opted for the 4-speed. Otherwise, it had 165, and no other 350 was offered. But the Camaro was showing its age, so 1981 was the last year of the second-generation car, with an all-new downsized Camaro for 1982, with the big engine being the 305, but still with 165 horsepower. Pontiac's version of the Camaro was the Firebird, also introduced in 1967, priced at $2,700 to start. A bit longer at 189 inches long on the same 108-inch wheelbase, and weighing just a bit more. First-year sales were over 80,000. It used a base 3.8-liter 230 cubic inch overhead cam straight six with 155 to 165 horsepower, or 215 horsepower in the Sprint package, a high 17-second car. V8s were either the 5.3-liter 326 with 250 to 285 horsepower, a mid-15-second car, or a restricted 6.6-liter 400 with 325 horsepower, a mid-13-second car. For 1968, the 6 was up to a 4.1-liter 250 with 175 to 215 horsepower. The 326 was replaced by a 5.8-liter 354 with 265 to 320 horsepower, advertised as a 350, while the 400 was 330 to 340 horsepower. Styling was freshened for 1969, getting 2 inches longer and gaining about 50 pounds. It would also see the introduction of the Trans Am, which did not compete in the racing series of the same name. Like the Camaro, new models arrived in 1970, only with a fastback body style. Size was little changed, as was the engine lineup, but the base 4.1-liter 250 straight six was now the overhead valve Chevrolet engine with 155 horsepower. The 354 was only offered in 255 horsepower tune, and the 400 came in 265 horsepower Esprit and Formula or Trans Am with 330 or 345 horsepower. For 1971, the 6 was down to 145 gross horsepower, or 110 net, the 354 down to 250 gross horsepower, or 165 to 180 net, and the 400 265 to 300 gross horsepower, or 180 to 250 net. But it now could be had with a 7.5-liter 455 with 325 to 335 gross horsepower, or 255 to 305 net horsepower, a low 14-second car capable of over 120 miles an hour. Power changes for 1972 had the 354 at 160 to 175 horsepower, the 400 at 175 to 250, and the 455 at 300. But in 1973, when its big engine competition would be gone, the 455 Super Duty Trans Am bumped power back up to 310, while the 6 was down to 100 horsepower, the 354 150 horsepower, and the 400 170 to 230. The required 5-mile-an-hour bumpers forced a styling update for 1974, adding 4 inches and 100 pounds, and power shifted yet again to 155 to 175 for the 354, 175 to 225 for the 400, and 250 to 290 for the 455. For 1975, there was a new wraparound rear window, and the Super Duty was gone, leaving a 200 horsepower high-output 455 as the last of the big V8 pony cars. Well, that and the 185 horsepower 400 cubic inch version, perhaps explaining why sales had been on a steady rise the last few years. But the 455 would only last another year, and the engine lineup would change with the facelift of 1977. The base engine changed to a 3.8-liter Buick V6 with 105 horsepower. A new 5-liter 301 V8 was added with 135 horsepower. The 354 and the Chevy 350 that replaced it in California were both rated at 170 horsepower, while the 400 took the performance mantle with 180 to 200 horsepower, or an 185 horsepower Oldsmobile 403, both marketed as a 6.6-liter. And the Trans Am could still be a low 16-second car, but a higher performance version would return the next year, officially rated at 220 horsepower, although many critics suggested that had to be conservative. But the Pontiac 354 went away the same year in favor of the Chevy 350, and a Chevy 5-liter 305 with 135 horsepower. There was another facelift for 1979, and a 150 horsepower version of the 301, while it was the last year of the 400, with the performance option becoming a turbocharged version of the 301 with 210 horsepower. It was only available with the automatic, but it could still do the quarter mile in just over 16 seconds. 1981 was the final year of the Pontiac B8, and the all-new Firebird of 1982 would differ from the Camaro only in style. Also in 1967, Mercury got its own upmarket version of the Mustang as the Cougar. It was a bit bigger at 190 inches long on a 111-inch wheelbase and weighing around 3,000 pounds. Prices started between $2,800 and $3,200. Unlike the Mustang, it was only offered with V8s, starting with a 4.7-liter 289 with 200 to 225 horsepower, through a 6.4-liter Marauder 390 with 320 horsepower. A mid-14-second car capable of nearly 135 miles an hour, and first-year sales were over 150,000. For 1968, the 289 would be replaced by a 5-liter 302 with 210 to 230 horsepower, and the 390 came in 280 to 325 horsepower tunes. And there was a new GTE with a 7-liter 390 horsepower 427 that was capable of nearly 135 miles an hour and a quarter mile in just over 14 seconds. But it was replaced mid-year by a 335 horsepower 428. For 1969, the car got a facelift, being nearly 4 inches longer and nearly 4 inches wider, and gaining more than 100 pounds. It also gained an Eliminator appearance package. The base engine was enlarged to a 5.8-liter 351 Windsor with 250 to 290 horsepower, and the only 302 available was the Boss, also with 290 horsepower. It gained another 2 inches in 1970, and the 4-barrel 351 Windsor was replaced by a 351 Cleveland with 300 horsepower, and the 390 was dropped. There was a new bigger Cougar for 1971, gaining another 2 inches in length, an inch in wheelbase, and nearly 2 inches in width, all adding up to only about 100 pounds. The 351 Cleveland was the base engine with 240 to 270 horsepower, and the option was a 7-liter 429 with 370 horsepower, a mid-14-second car with a top speed over 135, which would be dropped for 1972, and horsepower would move to net ratings, putting the base 351 at 164 horsepower and leaving the 266 horsepower 351 Cobra Jet as the top engine, a high 14-second car with a top speed near 130. But bigger bumpers would add length and weight again for 1973. Not that it mattered much, as there was an all-new Cougar for 1974, and where the Mustang moved to a smaller, lighter design, the Cougar moved upmarket to a bigger, heavier mid-size platform, aimed at competing with the likes of the Chevrolet Monte Carlo. AMC entered the pony car market in 1968 with the Javelin as the successor to the bigger Marlin. It was 190 inches long on a 109-inch wheelbase and weighed 2,900 to 3,200 pounds, with prices starting around $2,500. There was an available Go package that added upgraded suspension, brakes, wheels, and more. Base engine was a 3.8-liter 232 straight 6 with 145 horsepower, and V8s came in 4.7-liter 290 and 5.6-liter 343 with 200 to 280 horsepower. Sales were just over 55,000, and top models were capable of around 125 miles an hour and a quarter mile in under 15 seconds. Mid-year, a 6.4-liter 390 with 315 horsepower was added, making it a mid-14-second car, with no other significant changes for 1969, outside of a mod package with a Craig Breedlove spoiler and simulated side exhaust. 1970 models got a facelift with a longer hood and upgraded suspension, along with 2 new V8s. A 210 horsepower 5-liter 304 replaced the 290, and a 250 to 290 horsepower 5.9-liter 360 replaced the 343, while the 390 was up to 325 horsepower. And there would be a Trans Am edition, not a version for the races, but to commemorate its success in them. The actual racing version was the Mark Donohue edition, which introduced the so-called ducktail. The car would be restyled for 1971, following the trend of beefier pony cars, but only an inch longer on an inch longer wheelbase, while being an inch lower with no significant weight gain, although the top engine grew to a 6.6-liter 401 with 330 horsepower, gross, and it gained an AMX appearance package, a name that had previously been used on a shorter 2-seat model based on the Javelin. Updates for 1972 included the first one-year bumper-to-bumper warranty, or buyer protection plan, and the Pierre Cardin Designer Series, an $85 option that was described as daring interior design. Of course, horsepower ratings also changed to net, putting the 6 at 100, the 304 at 150, the 360 at 175 to 220, and the 401 at 255, but still making it a mid-14-second car. There was a minor facelift for 1973 due to bumper regulations, but it was far less noticeable than on many other cars. But weight was still up more than 100 pounds, and it would gain standard bumper guards the next year, when power was actually down on the 401 to 235 net horsepower. But sales of the Javelin were never very good, so 1974 was its final year, with no replacement. The last to arrive was the Dodge Challenger, not appearing until 1970, as an upmarket version of the Barracuda. As such, it was slightly bigger at 191 inches long on a 110-inch wheelbase, and weighing 3,100 to 3,900 pounds, with prices starting between $2,800 and $3,500. Base engine was the 3.7-liter 225 slant 6 with 145 horsepower, followed by the 5.2-liter 318 V8 with 230 horsepower. The 5.6-liter 340 had 275 horsepower, except in the TA or Trans Am package, which used a tricarb setup for 290 horsepower. The 6.3-liter 383 also had 290 horsepower, or up to 330 or 335 in the RT models, which could also be had with a 375 horsepower 7.2-liter 440 or 390 horsepower 446 pack, or the 7-liter 425 horsepower 426 Hemi, which could be a 13-second car when equipped with the Super Pack. First-year sales were over 85,000, but declined rapidly. Naturally, changes were pretty minor for 1971, outside of a cheaper 3.2-liter, 198 cubic inch slant 6 being offered. It provided 125 gross horsepower, or 105 net. The move to net ratings had the bigger 6 to 110, the 318 to 155, the 340 to 235, the 383 to 250, the 446 pack to 330, and the Hemi to roughly 350. But the bigger engines, the 383, 426, and 440, would all go away for 1972, when the car received a minor facelift, making the top model the 240 horsepower 340 Rally, a mid-15-second car capable of more than 115 miles an hour. For 1973, the 6s were dropped, and updates were primarily regulatory. Then 1974 upgraded the 340 to a 5.9-liter 360, adding 5 horsepower and 30 foot-pounds of torque, shaving nearly half a second off the quarter-mile time. But sales were barely over 10,000, and the Challenger was killed off, to return a few years later as a rebadged Mitsubishi. It looked like the mid-70s would be the end of the segment, but they survived and regained popularity in the 80s, when they were more typically referred to as American GTs than pony cars. But there were American GTs before there were pony cars. So as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below and like and subscribe.